and welcome to the Full Scottish on Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Kevin Archibald. Our guests this week are Alison Phipps, Professor of Languages and Intercultural Studies at UNESCO, Chair in Refugee Integration through Languages and the Arts, and Kim McDonald, Managing Editor of the iScot magazine. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll start off with the BBC copyright wings over Scotland Story and Peter Curran's YouTube channel getting shut down. So Ken, cock up or conspiracy?
Oh gosh, it could be a bit of both. Actually, it depends on your perspective. I find it rather confusing that Scott Arthur had said he had never made any complaint directly to the BBC, but just referenced Wings and Moradura in some correspondence that he had. But this has been a spectacular PR disaster for the BBC in trying to address the furore about the whole situation, and I find it actually quite amusing more than anything else. Although I do believe that this situation has actually knocked the dark money saga off the news, and I don't know whether it's an element of that that's involved too.
A lot of people are quite confused because the BBC argue that they were responding to Councillor Arthur, but then at the same time Councillor Arthur says he was responding to the BBC, giving him a heads up. So there's two questions there. One, who is correct? And two, does this show a certain bias or kind of privilege to Scott Arthur compared to Wings Over Scotland and Peter Curran, who had their channel shut down?
Yeah, well, the copyright laws are fairly clear and standard, but it's just unusual that just these two guys have been picked out to happen to be the most prolific indie bloggers today. Certainly, there are people who just see and feel what the BBC does to the news reporting, and they are institutionally biased in the sense that their remit is to promote the harmony and cohesion within the United Kingdom. But sadly, I think they conflate to promote with the word protect the union, and therefore sometimes they may get a bit over enthusiastic in what they decide to report as being valid for them and others that would be unfavourable to the state. So yeah, possibly it could be, but then again, I don't think there is a great big situation whereby every morning somebody wakes up and says, how can we shaft the indie movement today? It's just purely and simply the way the BBC operates, you know.
Alison, from maybe outside of the kind of sort of battle bubble itself, how would you view this scenario? Would you say the BBC themselves has a bad image from this, or would you say that actually the BBC are just going through a fair process?
I mean, it strikes me the BBC at the moment is certainly giving us plenty to criticise it for. We're actually seeing really frightening statistics about who is being given airtime and who isn't. Yeah. And it strikes me that for a public broadcasting authority, then we really have some serious questions to ask critically when we see the evidence of who is being given airtime and who isn't. Yeah. I mean, that said, I think it's actually part of a much wider set of questions about the quality of our media, who controls our media, how private media is run, the intersections between copyright and between the public media, the private media. And a lot of this, I think, has been picked up brilliantly by Carol Cadwallader in the work that she's been doing, and really showing and digging into this nebulous, murky world of who owns YouTube, who owns Google, who's on the board, what are the profits, who is able to exert what kind of influence, who's profiting as shareholders from these corporations, and what's happening when these different platforms that we've all bought into, we've all, seemingly quite easily surrendered many of our own freedoms to, what happens when they start to intervene in the processes of democracy and free speech and debate. So to me, those are the deeper structural questions, and the debate about the YouTube channels, the BBC, Wings Over Scotland this week is yet another example. It's this week's example. But last week we have Facebook, we have all the questions about what is and is not allowed and how on Twitter, on policing hate speech, all of these things which are part and parcel, I think, of the structural questions that underlie this particular instance this week. And this week, it's about how a certain set of powerful interests can try and exert control and a silencing act over a particular area of broadcasting. Next week it'll be another one. I don't know what I predict, but I predict there'll be something else where we can see these areas suddenly being used or mobilised as part of this particular dimension of work.
many would maybe defend the BBC by saying that actually, maybe despite the PR slight disaster, they've treated all parties within this argument fairly. Scott Arthur claims that he was treated the exact same as Windsor Scotland and Peter Curran. Is that the case in your view?
I don't necessarily see that as the case. Was Arthur's website shut down?
Arthur's website was not shut down. He had hundreds of videos, and from what was seen, that most of them were put on private, whereas Windsor Scotland and Curran had the website shut down without notification. But from your perspective, would you say that is, equal treatment?
If copyright is the reason they've used for closing them down, then his should have been closed down anyway, regardless whether private or otherwise. It's a simple, straightforward fact. But I think the bigger picture here, you have to remember that the BBC isn't independent. I mean, it's funded directly from our payments for a licence fee through the government, and 11 out of 13 trustees are appointed by the UK government, so therefore they're not going to, certainly in any shape or form, say anything that would cause issues to the guy who's paying the piper. So Scott Arthur, why would he reference Wings, and why would he reference Peter? I mean, why select them? I absolutely no idea. But I certainly don't think it's a cock-up. I think it may well be some mischief-making that's suddenly blown up in their face, and they're trying to justify the reasons why there is no solid argument to delete Wings or Moradura's website. I mean, I don't even know if Moradura's website's back up and running. I know the Wings is as of yesterday, but the BBC's got some explaining to do. But again, let's not forget dark money. We have to remember that there may well be the situation whereby this stuff's just been created to get this dark money situation off the page. And where is our Secretary of State for Scotland? He's in New Zealand, far, far away from cameras and any questioning of the kind of questions that need to be asked regarding his involvement and how he benefited from any money.
So you're arguing essentially that the culprits of the situation are basically duck and cover, essentially, whilst avoiding any kind of stories, as you mentioned.
We can only speculate. I mean, this could just be a complete small story that's just blown up, but you never can tell with the BBC, you never can tell with the UK government. In fact, you just can't believe anything. The fact that they're supposed to be responsible adults doing certain things, just look at what's happening today. Anything could be possible regarding the situation. But the fact of the matter is, people aren't daft, and they do realise that something's stinking at the BBC, certainly in BBC Scotland, but the BBC in general, and this needs to be, this boil needs to be lanced.
You yourself brought up the wider themes of Facebook and Twitter, and as corporations, the wider themes of corporations, having maybe an agenda possibly, or just mismanaging it. Do you want to expand on that? So, what was it specifically about Facebook you brought as your example?
I think just more widely, it's really about us all getting used to a very new environment. Social media platforms are relatively new, and like any new way or new technology, it takes us a while to get used to using them and using them well, understanding what also all the legalities are of using them. So this is a context, with many of the social media platforms which are actually privately owned, and where copyright legislation is in place, but also where we're not really sure yet how that maps out in terms of what the influence is over a democratic process and over issues to do with freedom of speech. We're still, I think, going to see a number of test cases in law that will be brought to actually help us understand and navigate these landscapes. And at the moment, we're learning, and we need really good critical thinking, really good questions that our broadcasters will ask, that our MPs will ask, and our politicians will ask of the corporations. So we need full accountability of all of the social media platforms. It's very important that Mark Zuckerberg had to appear in the United States and answer questions of democratically elected politicians. The same needs to be happening, and is happening, to be fair, within processes within our own government, and this needs to continue. We need the accountability, because democracy is nothing if we are not all held accountable to standards of truthfulness and fairness and freedom. So to me, those are the wider issues at stake. And I think, if I may, a brilliant example of this at work this week was in the way that French journalist Marwan Mohammed took apart the article by Andrew Malone in the Daily Mail called Powder Keg Paris, and on about 11 different counts, absolutely fact-checked it to within an inch of its life, to show that every single source of information that Andrew Malone had used in the article had come from far-right websites and was incorrect. From the statistics through to the assumptions made about cultural practices. It was an absolutely brilliant piece of journalistic takedown and very, very helpful for campaigns like Stop Funding Hate, who I think have done a remarkable job of holding newspapers to account who have been really falling foul of good journalistic practice and good critical practice. And this is not in any way about saying that we need a media that only promotes our point of view. Absolutely not. We need really excellent critical journalism that will hold everyone to account. And the work that Marwan Mohammed has done has been superb. And certainly Stop Funding Hate has really demonstrated how much its campaign has been working, particularly with some of the articles in the Daily Express recently. And I think their campaign to say who is advertising in these newspapers and just to ask us, please just stop buying this newspaper, stop buying newspapers that do not do journalistic work well and to the quality that we would accept. That has been a really good way of campaigning, and stop funding hate, start spreading love. It's a really lovely hashtag, and I'd really recommend anybody to look at what they're doing and also who they're recommending we write to. It's only a couple of clicks that you have to do, but today it was Vodafone, it was Laura Ashley, and a list of other companies who've been advertising in the Daily Mail on the day that they had that highly inaccurate, hateful piece of journalism on the situation in Paris at the moment.
So Don't Fund Hate obviously advocate for not buying papers like the Daily Mail and any other platform which advocates almost fake news / false stories or even further afield lies. Would you say that maybe, however, government can get involved in actually maybe create a reform to hold media to account, and if so, what kind of ideas do you have in your own head? Like, one of the big ideas is if a paper puts out a false story on their headline, the apology should go on to the headline with that. Would you agree with ideas like that, or would you say it's too far and government are stepping in too much? That's open to both of you, but
I just don't like any government interference in the media at all, period. The BBC should be totally independent and it should be self-funding. So you need to get government out of it. Government should not be interfering in our lives whatsoever unless we need them to interfere, where we request them to happen. The media, the mainstream media in the UK is certainly only owned by 5 very wealthy individuals that have got vested interests in ensuring that their monies are protected. Many of them don't even have their financial assets based in the UK. They are offshore, and all the trash, in inverted commas, that we received during the Brexit campaign, I think was pretty appalling. Absolutely appalling, the information that was coming across, and certainly the need for an independent media is pretty urgent. Wings Over Scotland, by the way, as you're just going to say, instead of, as well as Carol, he's pretty forensic in his trashing of a lot of the mainstream media stuff in Scotland. So he is possibly enemy number one for a lot of people who have vested interest in keeping the status quo. We would like to see change. We'd like to see change, people supporting the likes of Wings and Peter Bell and Jason, to get the strength, coverage, and actually the breadth and depth of independent media that we need today, which you will not get, I firmly believe, from the existing mainstream media.
Alison, again, it's the same question. The ideas that, like, if a newspaper presents a lie or misleading headline, the correction should be on the exact same measure, on the same headline the next day or whenever they're corrected. Do you believe measures like that should be taken, or do you believe that such regulations are a bit too far and that it should be more to independent groups to hold media to account?
I would say both and. I mean, I would think if you have published something which is factually incorrect and which damages people and their reputations, the apology should be in the same place, in the same font size, with the same priority, and also on a day when you are pretty sure that the circulation figures will be identical to what they were when the first piece went out.
But then you'd be accused of freedom of press intrusion, and it's.
I do believe that the press have a duty to print accurate news, and that where they don't, then the apology is is needed, and we need to know that that was inaccurate just as much as we need to know what is accurate. I also think that we've seen many good examples in this social media age of people with really often quite narrow expertise. You know, the heroes of the piece are often the geeks who will go into that detail, that forensic detail, dig around in the minutes of the board meetings and on the online documentation and looking in the caches to see what's actually there, to say who has said what when, what is accurate, and let's hold everyone to a higher standard. Now, within that environment, you're also going to discover that every single one of us is a hypocrite. Yeah. And every single one of us has at some point said one thing and then, do you know, I've just changed my mind, and that was a really good point you made. Maybe I'm just going to shift my position here. And that too is absolutely part of a healthy democratic society where we are good at dialogue and debating issues. And for me, the work of apology from the press, where it gets it wrong and where it's proven to get it wrong, is actually part of living in a society that knows how to practice truth and reconciliation. Yeah. And we've a lot to learn from other countries in the world where truth and reconciliation processes have been in place. And the press have a particular role in that kind of debate, in actually helping us all to understand what it means to say, do you know what? I'm sorry, I got that wrong. I heard your point. You're right. Let's move on. That's part of a healthy democratic society, not one where people say, I'm pure, I'm right, I stand here and I will never change. Yeah. So for me, the press have a really important role in actually helping us do that, as do our universities and our schools and our other organs of debate. So the Parliament as well is absolutely vital for that kind of work, which is why if a politician misleads Parliament, the sanctions are severe, and they should be.
Before we move on to the general theme of the media, we're about to you, Ken, just to conclude in Windsor Scotland Story BBC. Peter Kern's channel is still down. Wings have their channel back up with all their videos. Yeah. Is this the end of the story, or will more happen in the future?
I don't know what Stuart has in process. No doubt he's been taking legal advice to find out what options that he has, but it's just raised an argument which everybody kind of knew about, but nobody actually thought anything would happen. The fact that the BBC's now come out and done this, knowing fine well that 13 videos they had would get them automatically taken off, they must have known that this was going to be the situation. But it sounds so appalling that Arthur was allowed to come on and try and defend his position, saying he wasn't the guy that caused the fuss. There's something not quite right. I just can't put my finger on it. We don't know, but certainly there's more to come out of this story.
And BBC Scotland claim that they didn't know much about the situation themselves. It was more of a BBC London debate against Windsor Scotland. Do you believe that raises more questions, or do you believe that's quite normal?
BBC's a UK broadcaster.
Alright, we're going to move on to the next subject, which is basically the media / BBC exposure to the far right. Just very recently, actually, Simon Wren Lewis actually shared an article online. I say article, so actually more of an analysis by the British Journal of Political Science. And they found that the media has given disproportionate coverage of UKIP and other right-wing figures such as Nigel Farage. And they found that actually that when UKIP were on decline, the media increased their coverage of the party itself, which actually found the party then increasing in support for membership or just exposure in general and for polling. Now, we'll start with yourself, Alison. How do you take these findings from this group?
So I think it's really important that the research is being done, and what we need is good research on these sorts of areas. So you can have a gut feeling about, it feels like these particular groups are getting more attention than other points of view. You can have that feeling, but feelings are always fickle. There might be a kind of good gut reaction, but actually having people who go through it and do that careful, painstaking, often geeky work of finding out and actually giving us statistics, that's great, and that's really excellent work. And I think, as an academic, I'd say it's also really important for the top quality research, for that to be fully peer reviewed and to go through the ringer, and really for us to be sure of our facts in these situations. So really, that's great. Kudos to the people who are doing that work and are really paying attention on our behalf, so we know. That said, certainly my gut feeling was that this was happening, and ours is a household where we will roll our eyes if we hear yet again, particularly for BBC Question Time, that certain people are going to be on yet again, and so these figures in no way surprise me. And so then for me the question is, so how is it that this situation comes to be? And what are the decision-making criteria? Are they about people who are thought to be fun entertainers, good value? Are they about people who have a particular set of political views? And then, of course, you've got to actually look at what the guidance is on our public broadcasters for who should be given airtime or not. What I think was very interesting is that during those periods of purdah, where there are much stricter rules about what gets broadcast and what doesn't, opinion polls fluctuate considerably because there's more of an even playing field. And so I begin to wonder whether, given that everyone seems to be always campaigning at the moment, we actually might need a stricter set of guidance that is more like those that are in place during election periods, for us to be sure, as an electorate and within the polity, that what the situation is fair and legitimate. And that would just be one of my gut feelings at the moment, reading the statistics and now seeing evidence to what we have believed has been the case.
Ken, yourself, would you see this as the BBC and media failing to give equal ground, or would you maybe think there's possibly an agenda behind it, or a mix of both?
I think it's simpler than that. I mean, TV programmes exist because people watch them, so it's effectively clickbait. If you have somebody on there who's going to be controversial and will draw an audience, they've done their KPI of having a large viewing figure. Farage has a kind of Katie Hopkins effect in that he annoys people, so they don't necessarily agree with him, but the downside is that a few people tend to believe the stuff that comes out of his mouth, which is rather sad, as we now know. But
we know that he's been on Question Time over 30 times, which on the average of this decade means that he's been on more than anyone else on average, I point out. So again, with a man like Farage on Question Time, who had, with his party getting 2% of the overall support from the population, is this again evidence of disproportionate representation of the populist party? And again, would you speculate that maybe the BBC have an agenda?
I don't think there's an agenda,
just bad reporting?
I think they just view him as being the quintessential English pub guy that has that view, and therefore he represents many of their as it turns out, many of their viewers. But I doubt very much indeed if the BBC specifically sits down and has an agenda to say how we're going to direct a narrative in a certain direction. They are just the BBC. They're institutionally biased because of their makeup and the way that they're funded by government. But Farage was just purely and simply, I think, clickbait more than anything else.
Alison, we speak about UKIP and Nigel Farage being the centre figures of the BBC coverage, but also recently the BBC had criticism. As you may have known, there was a River Blood speech which was done in voice actor covering the speech, again a racist speech given by a Conservative MP 40, 50 years back. We had the discussion of to bring back the Treason Act for those who betray British values, and of course a certain individual as Tony Robinson being released from jail, and as he kind of a hero to a certain group of people. So it's not just UKIP, it's also these figures that are dangerously far right in political standards today. How do you see it then? Do you think this is the BBC being foolish, or do you believe that possibly the BBC are kind of scared just to kind of avoid these figures of controversy themselves?
Yeah. I mean, it's not just the BBC. The normalisation of figures from the far right in the mainstream media in particular is very clear, and it's a very clear strategy. And I think, again, there's been some very good work just looking at the way in which this happens. Again, Carol Cadwallader's work of seeing who knows who's talking to who on the far right, and how is it that these strategies are being mobilised to actually normalise debate? How is the notion of free speech and also the notions of censorship or accusations of censorship, how are they being used on both extremes of the political spectrum in order to erode those central tenets of democracy around a plurality of opinions, a plurality of views? So for me, that's an important dimension to what we're talking about here. I also think there's maybe another dimension here, which is, again, about that ability for us to practice good debate in public and for us to be able to see critically what is happening around us. And again, that's a job for education, for people to actually be able to recognise where it is that views are being introduced, which are potentially damaging to human rights and to those freedoms which have been central to democratic traditions for a long time. And I find myself again and again with I have a sheet on my desk at work, which is the Institute for Genocide Studies sheet of the 10 stages towards genocide. So research that's been done by academics studying genocides across the world. And one of their points, I think it's point 6, actually speaks about the kind of language of hate that is being used in the press or being used by politicians. So where is it that incentives to violence against certain groups is actually going on? And I do think that what we're seeing with the far right in the media at the moment is that stage starting to come into being within our own context. And that is where, and I speak as somebody whose studies were of Germany through the Holocaust. I speak as somebody who looked at 1920s, 1930s policies in Germany and across Europe as part of my early studies. It's really important that we understand historically how this happens, that we're able to do comparative work, looking at how these things have happened in other places, be it with the Kosovan genocide, the Rwandan genocide, other genocides that we have seen, or other contexts where there has been ethnocide, and that we can see what the responsibility is on politicians, on broadcasters, on academics, on people in public life, on artists, to really make sure we continue to live in a society with a plurality of views.
We'll come back to one of your examples you did on Weimar Germany, if you don't mind, because there's an interesting point which you raised there. But Ken, before we move on to that point, one of the figures that came from The Guardian more recently was trust in mainstream media. As low as it was already, it was at 36% and has declined to 24% overall. So would you say this decline in faith in our mainstream media is not only just bad for information, but also undermines our very democracy itself?
It's the worst, I think, in Europe, in Western Europe, as far as maybe Alison can confirm that.
No, that's right.
The advent of social media means that people now don't have a situation where they're presented by either one tabloid or one or two TV channels, as it was when I was growing up, that they can now find out for themselves. And this is why we, as a magazine for those of independent mind, is just don't believe everything you read. Even in our magazine, would say just find out for yourself facts and details. And the access of social media, which is now pretty much everybody's got access to it these days, means that people can suddenly realise that this paper I've been buying for the past 40 odd years is cat litter. Because frankly, what I used to believe and I've just now found out is just absolute tosh. And therefore they're beginning to vote with their money. And similarly, we're finding it the same with Sky TV channels are losing money hand over fist. We've now got Amazon coming into it. There's more and more avenues for people to find information, and they can cherry pick what they like and what they don't like, and by comparative analysis find out what they believe to be the case in certain articles. So it's just a new paradigm shift for media.
Alison, you brought up Weimar Germany, and I wanted to touch on that subject because it's personal, something I've actually done studied before. And you said in the 1920s, I remember I don't remember the 1920s, should I say, but something in the 20s. Just to stress, he led a large coalition in Weimar Germany, encompassing different views, and he managed to work with people together. And he managed to kind of, hold back much of the economic decline of the country. And then within a short span of a couple of years, we then jump to Nazi Germany. So, as you raised that point, what is it there that brought down the plurality of that of Weimar Germany to Nazi Germany?
So this is the huge question of the causes of the rise of National Socialism in Germany, and also, let's not forget, it wasn't just that we saw the rise of a right-wing, highly anti-Semitic set of views across Europe. These were also happening within our own context and across much of Europe. There are many different causes, but one of the ones that people often go back to, and I think it's one for us, is austerity. Austerity measures, and particularly the reparations after the First World War. There were many other elements which are then catalytic around that, and the ability to exploit people's fears who are living in poverty is one which is always extremely dangerous for the development of extreme views on the left or on the right. And I think it is really important. I think I'd also say that it was also a time of extraordinary creativity, as you mentioned, and my area of the arts, it's a real time of flowering, and where you see extraordinary extraordinary inventiveness by artists, just as we're seeing today, around these particular areas. You know, the playwright Bertolt Brecht would be an extraordinary example, but also the flowering of philosophy and critical thought, which again I think is beginning to happen. I certainly see across the student body that I teach in the universities at the moment a renaissance in critical thinking, and a commitment to creative critical ideas that in many ways I think has been a little absent during the age of high theory, and high theory can blossom at a time when things are reasonably peaceful in your own context. And right now, you know, the luxury of high theory, which is what it is, the ability to really spend hours reading books and thinking about them and just teaching, is being tested on the streets. It's being tested in the Mediterranean. It's being tested across the war zones of the world. It's being tested by the rise of the far right, particularly for people who wished us to preserve our democracy. And so I think, you know, that we always have to be extremely careful with any comparison that we make, but we also have to use history judiciously. History teaches us very interesting things, but it's particularly important for us to hold on to history as a way of looking at what our questions are. Why is it just now we're saying, Weimar Germany? Why is it we're saying, this is what it was like in Germany in the 1930s and during the Second World War? It's because we need to learn something from that, and we know it. Not because this is the same again, because it isn't. This is a very different age, these are very different concerns, but there's something about that period in history that we need for our imagination of something different and something better for the future.
So Ken, as has been pointed out, the media have a large role to play in the rise of the right/far right in terms of their political support. And also pointed out just now was austerity. Would you agree that austerity in terms of, you know, government welfare cuts and other areas of cutting back on public spending, do you believe that is a source of what's fueling the far right currently? And the right in general?
Absolutely. I mean, austerity is man-made. It's been created. So I mean, it can be easily fixed. We can find money to support the banks. We can find money if the government was so inclined to get rid of austerity here now. It's fairly straightforward. But there's an agenda, and the agenda is the protection of the establishment that Westminster currently has with the Conservative government. There are people who have got huge vested interests in Brexit happening, not the man at the street. I mean, we just can't afford it. We're just the guys that just have to suck it up. But I think certainly there are people who are beginning to suddenly realise that the pain, I mean, this Brexit situation is going to be an absolute disaster. I mean, beyond the disaster, this is huge. People just don't realise it, and it's been minimised to make it sound as if it's some kind of minor filling. And therefore, I believe there's a lot of people who are beginning to stand up and try to be counted, going back to Wings and Peter and a variety of other people that are saying, look, we've just had enough of this tosh. But they don't have the clout that the MSM has, or the BBC stations that are trying to... again, I would say that the BBC is not particularly setting the agenda. Maybe that there are people external to them that are making it happen through them. But there is a problem with austerity that can be fixed fairly easily, but people just don't want to have the political will to do it.
We're going to move on now, because we've discussed the media, we've discussed austerity, and a big issue as well is immigration and asylum seekers. And as you know, most recently we had Serco, who were housing around 300 asylum seekers, were planning on removing them from their current homes. But a lot of people don't know the background, and people don't know the specific details. So, Alison, would you be able to give kind of a brief introduction to what the story is really about, and any details I may have gotten right or wrong?
So brief introduction. The housing of asylum seekers is subject to procurement policies of the UK Government and Home Office. And Serco has the contract for around a third of the asylum seekers in the UK for their housing. Now, as a private provider, obviously, their duty is to their shareholders and to their profits. And Serco's own website states it has an operating profit of over 30 million. So this is a situation where you have profits being made by firms who have gone through the procurement policies of the UK government, the procurement policies which exclude many of our public sector or third sector housing providers. And so Serco have the contract. They have the contract for 3 areas in the UK, for Northern Ireland, for the northwest of England, and for Scotland. And Glasgow, as you know, has one of the largest populations of asylum seekers in the UK because of the dispersal policies of the UK government. That means that asylum seekers, when they land and are first assessed, will then be distributed to a city somewhere in the UK. So Serco has the contract, and there have been many problems with that contract. The housing is often very problematic, substandard, damp, and certainly doesn't always conform to what, under the Scottish Government, devolved powers, which is care for asylum seekers, would constitute adequate housing. So this is the strategy, the New Scots Refugee Integration Strategy. Scotland was one of the first countries to ever have a refugee integration strategy. The new strategy was launched in January 2018, and it's a rights-based strategy. So it's based and rooted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And under the category of housing, one of the key themes of the devolved powers for the care of asylum seekers and refugees, the whole section of that strategy begins with Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of themselves and their family, including food, clothing, housing and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond their control. Now, what's really important about this is that this is for everyone. So all the whataboutery that is in all those vile comment sections about anyone who is an asylum seeker or a refugee are irrelevant, because this is for everyone, regardless who might find themselves in a situation of destitution or need. Everyone has that right. So the rights-based approach is part of the devolved care for asylum seekers. Serco's policy of changing the locks, which is an appalling policy, not least because of their profits, so that's really secondary, but much more so because it is absolutely disputable in Scots law as to whether Serco have the right to do that. And both Govern Law Centre and the legal services agencies and other legal bodies in Scotland this week are launching their appeals against this, and putting case law to test in Scotland to see if Serco can actually do this. There's another really important dimension to this, which is quite a complicated area, but let's see if I can explain it simply.
Give it a try.
Yeah, let me give it a try. So these are people who are housed, so the asylum seekers in Serco accommodation are people who have had their right to housing cut by the UK government. So the funding for their housing is being cut. So Serco is no longer getting the money to provide the housing. They've had it cut because at the first stage their request for asylum has been refused. Now, what we know about the decision making for the Home Office is that it is quite appalling. It is a dreadful quality of decision making, and that about 45% of asylum seekers at the moment will have their claim for having a well-founded fear of prosecution actually acknowledged and given at the second stage of appeal. However, if you are refused at that first stage, all your benefits are cut. Now, this is a policy of enforced destitution by the UK Home Office. So you're out on the streets, you have a right to appeal, as we all have rights to appeal, only you haven't got anywhere to live and you haven't got any way of getting food, and the £37 a week that you would otherwise be entitled to, £37 a week, that's nothing for actually living. That's all you get as an asylum seeker in this country. And your housing, that's all gone. How on earth are you supposed to mount a legal claim for your appeal in those situations? So what Serco is doing is actually delivering the hostile environment on behalf of the government, and the procurement regulations of the UK government actually enable that delivery by the private providers. And Serco aren't the only one where this is actually happening. In other authorities, under other private provision, where the eye is not on the well-being of those individuals, it's on the shareholders' profits. It has to be, because that is the duty of the finance director of any private operator, is to serve the shareholders. Then that's the situation we're in. So what we need, and it's not sexy and it's not going to look good on a set of slogans, is a change to the procurement regulations, so that that period of waiting, right up to the point where all appeal rights are exhausted, that period means that what we say we want to do in Scotland, which is to give everybody the right to enjoy those standards of living that are adequate, that are under Article 25, will be true for anything that is part of a reserved matter to the Westminster Government. So here we are again in this territory of what's reserved, what's devolved, and what the space is for operating here within Scotland.
Ken, you are the editor of an independent, pro-independence magazine.
Pro-Scot magazine.
Pro-Scot magazine, sorry, I apologize. Pro-Scot magazine. Many critics or many unionist politicians would argue that Scotland has a very similar immigration views with Scotland and the rest of the UK. They're very similar, and therefore that's kind of reason why we should oppose independence. From what you've just heard just there, would you say that is the case, or would you maybe even go further with further points to make?
I doubt it very much indeed if we are the same, because we get different dynamics. I mean, we need people to come in to help future generations who are growing older and living longer, compared to London, which is really probably the catalyst for the whole Brexit idea. It's very difficult to compare the two and say that they're actually the same. Just to go back in the question that Alison just mentioned, the fact that I was quite pleased to see the turnout for people who were protesting about this, but more importantly was the Housing Association that didn't get mentioned, where they in fact are reinforcing the fact to Serco that they can't change locks because it's not part of their terms and conditions. They can't change any fixtures or fittings, and they are actively trying to stop this. So people are getting engaged and getting involved in that. But in Scotland, no, I think we are traditionally a social country that we welcome people with open arms. We just like inviting people to the country and showing them how good we can be. Sadly, we don't like people telling us how bad we have to be. That's the difference.
Alison, when it comes to, as you made the point of reaching out to help more asylum seekers, in your view, should that be more state provision, or do you believe it's better to be more outsourced, but maybe some regulations, or a bit of both? How do you see it? More government intervention, or more outsourcing but with regulations?
I would say a bit of both, to be honest, but I think it depends who's doing it as to whether it's good. You could have state provision for asylum seekers that is terrible, as we have in the UK at the moment, or you can have state provision for asylum seekers that is excellent, and that is actually really upholding the spirit of the Refugee Convention. I spend quite a lot of time travelling around the world, obviously with my work with UNESCO, and I see some really superb examples of what state provision can look like. I see some terrible examples of what state provision can look like. I see some excellent examples of private provision at times, and excellent examples of third sector provision. So it depends. What's important is that we agree on what good provision looks like, and actually we don't need to keep making that up. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Refugee Convention have provided a lot of detail as to what that looks like. For example, the right to settlement. For example, the right to be part of a democratic process. For example, the right to work. For example, the right to dignity. For example, within Scotland, what we have said, and this is very different to England and Wales, what we have said in Scotland is that integration for asylum seekers begins on day one of arrival in this country, and that is when our care as a country begins for asylum seekers. We have seen, based on the research, which is incontrovertible, that if you want a flourishing, cohesive society which is cosmopolitan and pluralistic, and when people can live together with intercultural dialogue, with harmony and tolerance, then what you need to do is give everybody the chance to integrate together. This isn't a task just on asylum seekers or refugees, that they have to somehow, in some magical way, become exactly like Joe Normal Scott, because number one, that doesn't exist. Nobody's normal when you really look at them hard, Cameron. But equally, it's the work of all of us. You know, this is a creative work for society.
Yeah.
When someone arrives in your home, you have to start adapting. You have to start asking questions. Your guests are going to arrive and go, do you want me to take my shoes off or not?
Right.
You know, where shall I put what I've brought? Do you want it in the fridge? Can I help you with the washing up? What happens in your home is no different to what happens in your country.
Yeah.
And that's what integrating into society is like, and it's constantly shifting and changing. So that provision is for all of us. We're all providers and provisioning of hospitality, and this is what this comes down to. And I would say it has been an extraordinary week of unity across grassroots organisations who once again have shown what a city Glasgow is.
Yeah.
This is the city of Mary Barber's army. This is the city of the rent strikes. This is the city that gave us the Glasgow Girls. This is the city where Jean and Noreen, those wonderful, Scots Women of the Year, actually prevented dawn raids in a careful, thoughtful, hugely intelligent campaign when those horrendous 4:00 raids were happening and people were being taken from their beds and their homes. This is a city that will not tolerate these kinds of attacks on their neighbours. And the size of the demonstrations has been really clear. The unity across the council, the housing providers, the unions, the grassroots organisations, the NGOs has been astonishing. And that is in a context, as we all know, within Scotland, when you've got lots of different organisations working together, they have different views, they often have robust, healthy debates with each other. And in this context, everyone has been united that yes, Serco are absolutely in breach of the spirit of New Scots integration strategy and of the work we're trying to do, in breach of the spirit of the city of Glasgow, which at this time is welcoming the European Championships and many tourists to the city. So in breach of that spirit of hospitality, but also in breach of, we believe, elements of Scots law in particular that need rightly testing in the courts, and I'm delighted that that work is actually going to happen. But I also think within this, there's something really fundamental about an attack on our neighbours, an attack on our neighbours who have fled persecution and who have asked us to give them sanctuary, and that in that situation, if we change the provider of Serco, and poor Serco, really, I mean, they've been putting out these bleating letters this week about how they've been subject to vile abuse on social media. Seriously, if this is the first time you've noticed what a sewer social media can be, you really haven't been paying attention. And what has been happening in those demonstrations and the universal call for direct action to stand with and in solidarity with anyone having their locks changed by our elected MPs, the 7 MPs in the city of Glasgow, has been extraordinary. So that, I really think, is one of the first times I've seen such a unified approach. But the problem is not Serco. Changing Serco was really, it's just led to the same problems we had before, which were with Orchard and Shipman. It's just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. The issue here is the hostile environment policy of the UK Home Office and government, and the setting up of rules and regulations which mean people are profiting from the misery of other people, and which mean that a hostile environment is being delivered by private profiteers. We can point to private companies that do excellent work at supporting people who are destitute. The Social Bite would be an excellent example. Places paying it forward and showing a very different spirit to how this can be done. But this isn't the case with Serco. Maybe Serco, if it was given a chance, if it was actually competing for housing provision that was actually according to a set of procurement regulations that said this will be in line with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and this waiting period will be funded, maybe then we would have what we need. But right now, it's the hostile environment. That genie needs putting back in the bottle, and we need instead to be fostering a hospitable environment for all. And in Glasgow, we have shown time and again that A, we know how to be hospitable, and B, we also know how to campaign against the hostile environment, and that we see that as our job.
Ken, a lot of people would say that this actually has a lot of similarities with the Windrush scandal, that took place not just so long ago. Would you agree with that idea? And secondly, in the hypothetical scenario that Serco actually win the court case and they have the right to change the locks and remove all 300 asylum seekers, what kind of reaction would you expect in the hypothetical scenario?
A reaction from the general public? Or?
General public, whoever you think would be.
I mean, it's not. If you think of the Highland clearances and the amount of Scots actually had to leave Scotland, and they were welcomed by open arms, and look at Canada, USA, New Zealand, Australia. I mean, immigration isn't a problem. It's just the attitude of certain people in certain positions of power that believe that they have the right to treat people like numbers. It's just not on. Scotland is a caring country. We actually care about our neighbours, and seems to be a big difference between even the idea of the Brexit result, where there's a huge majority for staying where we are, living within and working with our partners, as opposed to being insular and inward looking. So yeah, Windrush. Another disaster. I mean, Alison's the best person to speak on this one, but I just find it appalling that the Home Office actually, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, destroyed the records of the people that came over in the Windrush vessel. So therefore, when they tried to reapply for citizenship, even though they'd been there 50, 60 years, been here since they were bairns, they were refused to stay, because they couldn't find a piece of paper destroyed by the government themselves. And it just beggars belief. I mean, you can't even rationalise why they would do this. So I really don't know what the end result would be, but the government, we need to get rid of this government and change the whole process for dealing with people. It's pretty bad.
Alison, would you like to develop the point on the Windrush? Would you see that there are similarities between the Windrush scandal and the recent events with Serco, or would you say they're completely different?
Oh no, this is absolutely a piece. Windrush, the destruction of records. I mean, I have seen so many cases of people's asylum claims where they've been refused, where they've been sent a bundle of evidence that was nothing to do with them or their case. Yeah. I've seen cases where people who have been given an age from anything between 16 to 32. I have seen decision making which is utterly appalling, including a famous case actually, which was the subject of a wonderful play that was put on and toured around the country called The Claim, which was actually looking at the way the decision-making cases are actually done and the length of time that the interviews take that the decision-makers will go into, but one which said, you say that there is guerrilla activity in your country. We have consulted with a zoologist and there are no gorillas in your country. Now, if that is what is being done to people, and that's the level of decision-making at first stage that's going on, if we have a situation where, and we know this is the case, people are being incentivized within the Home Office to make negative decisions on people's asylum claims or on visit visas or on citizenship applications, and where again and again wonderful people like Colin Yeo and his Free Movement blog are forensically analysing, he's a barrister in London, forensically analysing the way in which decision making happens. And when a small administrative tweak is made, like last year in July, suddenly there was a change made that meant that it wasn't 5 years you had to wait after you'd got refugee status to be able to apply for citizenship, but 10. So all kinds of new things that were starting to happen in these intricacies of decision making. This is a piece, and you might have seen the really good piece that Kate Hutchison did this week on WOMAD, and Jon Snow, the Channel 4 presenters, his utter incandescent rage at the fact that these visit visas had been denied to travelling artists under the Tier 5 visit visa. And this is just normal. I mean, this time last year I was bringing in 20 Ghanaian dancers from a township in Ghana to perform at the UNESCO inaugural lecture and at the Solas Festival. These were people who were funded to do this work with me by the UK government, and the UK government was A, refusing them visas, B, charging them huge amounts of money to be able to make an appeal, or well, not to appeal it, but to be able to make an express new claim, which was well over £3,000, and then C, telling them in the refusal letter that they did not believe that they were going to be doing work with me. So you've got one government department refusing the 7-stage peer review process that the application goes through for people to come into a country. This is a piece. This is very poor quality decision making, and this is what delivers a hostile environment. And then back in Ghana, where I go regularly, or back in the Sudan, where I travel regularly, I hear what people say about the UK. So as well as crisis producing a hostile environment in this country very successfully, it also produces real damage to the UK in foreign policy terms. So I will sit with people in Ghana who are laughing at the UK because of the quality of decision making, saying, we used to think that you were the country of excellent higher education, of you were the mother of democracy, and then we see these letters and we can see how far you have fallen. You have a lot to learn from us now. So this is very, very damaging as a policy, the hostile environment. They're now calling it the compliance environment. It's no better. I mean, that's just, that's potentially compassion washing. There's nothing to it. And I really think what we need is a fundamental rethink of how we treat people and an acknowledgement of the incontrovertible evidence that immigration is good for countries. It is good for them on many different levels.
Final point on this subject, I'd like to ask, is there anything local authorities and the Scottish Government can do to help more, or is there limitations to what they can do based on the fact that issues are devolved and reserved?
Yeah, so the devolved reserve matters are key, but I would say that there is scope now, particularly since the Smith Commission and with the devolving of new powers, there's scope for more to be done. And I think it's really important for us to really hold our local authorities and also the Scottish Government to account on this, and to make sure that there isn't too much fancy footwork going on. Yes, for the SNP government, it is clear that the big prize is independence, but that should never be at the expense of the dignity, well-being and welfare of other people. Everyone has a right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. That's Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in a country, in Scotland, where we are really very serious about the importance of human rights, and where our constitutional commissions and our constitutional debates are around the fundamental importance of human rights to the country, we have to be serious about that. It's not easy, and I think the role of grassroots organisations is really important. And I think, a huge shout out to the many organisations who have mobilised this week, and for the work that's being done to keep people out of destitution. Room for Refugees, that is hosted by Positive Action in Housing. Over 700 people who are hosted. Those 700 people should not need to be hosted by private individuals like myself, who for the last 10 years have made a room available and lived with refugees. That should not be necessary. The Refugee Survival Trust should not be begging for money to be able to keep people out of destitution. We shouldn't be looking at the night shelter in Glasgow being closed down at the end of this month with nowhere to go for those young men who are destitute and homeless. Equally, we should not have anybody sleeping rough on our streets. In 2009, with the Homelessness Partnership, we were pretty much able to eradicate street homelessness in Scotland, and that was an extraordinary creative effort across many agencies in Scotland. Austerity and changes in rules and regulations from the UK government has meant that has now become the epidemic of street homelessness and destitution that it is. That means particularly women and children are the most vulnerable in those situations and are being put in really precarious situations. Gary Christie from the Scottish Refugee Council has said we live in a country at the moment where, because of the devolved care, then somebody giving birth in this country can have access to free health care in Scotland and then be put on the streets because of the way that the reserved powers operate. That has to change.
Well, we're just about to finish the programme just now, but thank you for that response there. Before we go, though, I'd like to ask Ken, as editor of the iScot magazine, would you like to tell us in detail what is in this month's edition of the magazine?
Our lead story is about dark money. And by Jaggett, and specifically about the Shield of Truth, or the Shield of Ruth as we call it, which relates to the BBC's inability to actually speak to her and narrow down the situation regarding this funding. It's also been alleged that David Mundell, who is conveniently in New Zealand at this minute in time, trying to generate trade up to $1 billion, I believe, whereby the European Union creates 240 billion, said that everything is above board, although we believe we're hearing snippets that he may well have indeed allegedly benefited from some of that £319,000. So yes, it's quite interesting article. This is the largest issue we have, 124 pages. So it's well worth buying.
Thanks very much, Ken, for that. And that's it for this week's Full Scottish. Thanks to Alison and Ken for joining us, and thanks to you for watching.
Thank you.
For more information, you can visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot. You can also subscribe for £5 a month, which will allow us to keep making our programmes. Look out for Scotland at 7 through the week on Broadcasting Scotland. I'll be back next Sunday at noon. See you then. Bye now.